On November 24, 1857, at a plantation residence close to the Combahee River in South Carolina, 8 members of the Rutledge family gathered for their annual Thanksgiving dinner. By daybreak, every one of the 8 had perished. The official county documentation attributes the cause to acute gastric fever, a fairly standard diagnosis for that period. However, hidden within the private letters of Dr. Silas Beaumont, the physician who attended to the dying, is a solitary sentence which local historians made strenuous efforts for decades to keep hidden. The symptoms align with no fever I have encountered throughout 30 years of medical practice. What motivated authorities to be so resolute in concealing the reality regarding that November evening? What actually occurred within the dining room of Sweetwater Hall? And what explains the nearly 40-year delay before anyone would utter the name of the woman who prepared that last meal? Before we proceed with the account of Sweetwater Hall and the Rutledge family, I would like to pose a question to you. This channel delivers to you the most grim and unsettling narratives from American history. Stories that have been interred, overlooked, or intentionally concealed. If you value the research and narrative craftsmanship involved in revealing these enigmas, kindly subscribe and activate that notification bell to ensure you do not miss an episode. I am also interested to know where you are listening from at this moment. Share your state or city in the comments down below. It assists me in comprehending the locations of our community of dark history aficionados. Now, allow us to return to that November evening in 1857 and uncover what resulted in one of the most carefully orchestrated acts of retribution in the antebellum South. The occurrences of that night did not commence at the dining table. They originated decades earlier in situations that would influence everything that came after. Sweetwater Hall was positioned 3 miles inland from the Coombe River, a somewhat modest plantation by low country measures, encompassing just under 200 acres of rice paddies and around 40 enslaved individuals. The primary residence, erected in 1798, had belonged to the Rutledge family for 2 generations. By 1857, its age was evident. The white pillars required fresh paint. The shutters on the 3rd floor hung askew, and the kitchen structure, detached from the main house by a covered passage, had a continual leak that nobody bothered to repair. Colonel Marcus Rutledge, aged 63 that November, had taken over the estate from his father in 1832. By plantation standards, he was not a wealthy individual. The rice harvest had been lackluster for 3 successive years, forcing him to sell portions of land to clear debts. His wife, Constance, 58, hailed from Charleston society and had never quite forgiven him for relocating her to what she termed the Mosquito Kingdom. Their 4 grown children had all stayed close, either incapable or reluctant to build lives elsewhere. The eldest son, Marcus Jr., 36, had not succeeded at law school and came back home to run the plantation with remarkable ineptitude. His wife, Rebecca, 32, dedicated much of her time to composing letters to relatives in Charleston, lamenting the seclusion. The second son, Thomas, 33, struggled with a gambling habit that kept him constantly indebted to his father. The daughter, Elizabeth, 29, had been engaged on 2 occasions but never wed, earning a reputation for a sharp tongue and an even sharper disposition. The youngest son, William, 26, had studied medicine for a single year prior to coming home, asserting that the sight of blood made him unwell. This was not a happy family. They were not even a particularly functional family. What united them was not affection, but routine, duty, and the mere reality that none possessed an alternative destination. In the kitchen building, isolated from this dysfunction by a span of 40 feet and an even wider gap of circumstance, labored a woman named Patience. She was 38 years old in 1857, though she appeared older. Plantation records categorized her as house property assessed at $700 in the estate inventory of 1849. Sweetwater Hall had been her birthplace. Her mother, referenced in documents solely as Old Bess, had toiled in that same kitchen until her passing in 1846. Patience had acquired cooking skills at her mother's side, commencing at age 6. By 1857, Patience had been preparing the Rutledge family's meals for over 30 years. She knew with precision how Colonel Rutledge preferred his coffee, how Rebecca would return any dish containing excessive pepper, how Thomas would consume anything if sufficiently inebriated, which was most evenings. She understood the family's habits, their inclinations, their hidden matters, and their vulnerabilities better than they understood themselves. What she also carried, what she had borne every single day for 11 years, was that on March 7, 1846, Marcus Jr. had sold her 10-year-old daughter, Grace, to a cotton dealer from Alabama who was traveling through the region seeking young domestic servants. He had done this while his father was away in Charleston on business, and he had done it without informing Patience in advance. She had been occupied with dinner preparations when Grace was seized. She heard her daughter's screams emanating from the front of the house. By the moment she arrived at the yard, the wagon was already progressing down the Oakline Drive. Grace's visage, pressed against the wooden planks, constituted the last sight Patience ever had of her child. Marcus Jr. had taken the $200 and used it to settle a gambling debt. When Patience confronted him, weeping, pleading to learn where her daughter had been transported, he struck her across the face with the back of his hand and informed her that, offspring were property, not persons, and she needed to keep that in mind. Colonel Rutledge, upon his return and discovery of his son's action, had been enraged, not because a child had been ripped from her mother, but because Marcus Jr. had acted without authorization and had sold the girl too cheaply. He commented that at least $250 could have been obtained. He made no attempt to find Grace or recover her. For 11 years, Patience cooked their meals. For 11 years, she smiled when required to smile, lowered her gaze when required to lower her gaze, and responded with, "Yes, sir," and "Yes, to every directive and slight. For 11 years she bided her time, and for 11 years she acquired knowledge. She learned which wild plants growing in the forest behind the plantation could induce vomiting and which could trigger something considerably more severe. She learned this from old Isaiah, who worked in the stables and had been a root doctor prior to his enslavement. Isaiah exercised caution regarding what he taught. However, Patience possessed patience. She learned gradually, posed inquiries carefully, and never disclosed her genuine intent. She learned about oleander, which grew in decorative bushes surrounding the main house. Beautiful and lethal. She learned about pokeweed berries, which might be confused for elderberries if one was not vigilant. She learned about water hemlock root, which could be pulverized into a powder, and which in adequate amounts would produce convulsions, paralysis, and death within hours. She also learned about quantity, about timing, about physical reactions. Isaiah, though he never directly inquired about her intentions with this knowledge, appeared to comprehend. Before his death in 1855, he imparted one final piece of advice. If your goal is to make them suffer, you administer it gradually. If your goal is to make a statement, you administer it all at once. Patience aimed to make a statement. The choice to act on Thanksgiving Day was not arbitrary. Patience had been formulating the particulars for over 2 years, ever since Marcus Jr. had remarked casually one morning at breakfast in 1855 that he was glad he never squandered money buying back that little wench because she had likely died of fever by that time anyway. He had chuckled while saying it. Rebecca had also laughed. Thanksgiving at Sweetwater Hall was consistently a formal occasion, notwithstanding the family's diminishing prosperity. Constance Rutledge demanded the preservation of specific standards. The dining room would be adorned with pine boughs and dried blooms. The fine china would be taken from storage, the silver polished until it shone. All family members were obliged to attend, dressed appropriately, and to endure the complete meal without objection. November 24, 1857 was unusually warm. The morning had been misty, but by mid-afternoon the sun had broken through, leaving the atmosphere thick and heavy. In the kitchen building, Patience had been laboring since before daybreak. She had prepared the customary dishes: roasted turkey, ham glazed with brown sugar and cloves, sweet potato casserole, rice with gravy, cornbread dressing, collard greens, cranberry sauce, 3 different varieties of pie. The kitchen was oppressively hot, the wood stove radiating heat, and Patience's dress was drenched with perspiration by midday. Yet she worked with exceptional precision that day. Each dish was crafted to perfection. The turkey skin was golden and crisp. The ham glistened. The pies had been baked for precisely the proper duration, their crusts flaky and golden brown. And into 8 of the 9 play settings she had incorporated her years of carefully accumulated knowledge. The technique was straightforward, almost elegantly simple. Water hemlock root, dried and ground into a fine powder, had been blended into the brown sugar glaze coating the ham. The quantity was accurately measured to be deadly for an adult, yet slow-acting enough that symptoms would not manifest immediately. Her desire was for them to complete the meal. She wanted them to recline together, content and full, before the initial cramps commenced. The 9th place setting at the distant end of the table was distinct. That was where Samuel, the domestic servant who ordinarily helped with serving, would sit after the family had been attended to. His food originated from separate pots, prepared with identical care, but lacking the addition she had made to theirs. At 4 o'clock, as the November sun started its descent, the Rutledge family convened in the dining room. Colonel Rutledge occupied the head of the table, Constance at the foot. The children and their spouses filled the sides. The conversation was tense, as was customary. Thomas was already intoxicated. Elizabeth made several acerbic remarks regarding Rebecca's attire. Marcus Jr. complained about cotton prices as though he had any role in cotton cultivation. Patience and Samuel brought out the dishes course after course. The family ate with gusto. Colonel Rutledge commended the turkey. Constance observed that the ham was exceptionally fine this year, the glaze flawlessly balanced. Marcus Jr. consumed 3 servings. Thomas ate steadily, systematically, scarcely pausing between mouthfuls. Rebecca picked at her food as usual, yet even she finished most of her ham. By 5:30, the meal was concluded. The family withdrew to the parlor for coffee and brandy, following their custom. Patience and Samuel cleared the table. In the kitchen, Samuel consumed his portion of the food, while Patience washed the initial load of dishes. At approximately 6:15, Elizabeth Rutledge started to vomit. Within 10 minutes, all 8 members of the family were undergoing intense gastrointestinal distress. Dr. Beaumont, who resided 2 miles distant, was sent for immediately. He arrived at 7 o'clock to discover the Rutledge family in various phases of collapse. The indications were identical across all 8 patients. Violent vomiting, severe abdominal cramping, profuse perspiration, and swiftly advancing muscular weakness. By 8 o'clock, the initial convulsion started. Thomas Rutledge, the sturdiest of the group, was first. His body arched backward with such force that Dr. Beaumont later testified he heard vertebrae crack. The convulsions extended to the others in rapid order. Colonel Rutledge, Marcus Jr., Rebecca, William, Elizabeth, and finally Constance all began to seize. The sounds emanating from the upper floor of Sweetwater Hall that evening were characterized by neighboring plantation proprietors as ungodly and resembling the cries of animals caught in traps. Dr. Beaumont applied every remedy he knew. Induced vomiting, which the patients were already undergoing. Charcoal mixtures, which they could not retain. Laudanum, which had no impact on the convulsions. Nothing proved effective. The patients kept deteriorating, their bodies racked by spasms, their breathing becoming progressively more labored. William Rutledge died first at 9:45. His heart simply ceased between convulsions. Thomas followed at 10:30. Elizabeth endured until midnight. Rebecca, notwithstanding her small stature and customary delicacy, struggled until 1 in the morning. Marcus Jr., the man who had sold a 10-year-old girl for $200, expired at 1:45. His countenance fixed in a grimace of anguish. Colonel Rutledge and Constance, possibly because they had consumed less of the ham, survived the longest. They passed away within minutes of one another just before dawn. The Colonel's final utterances, witnessed by Dr. Beaumont and recorded in his documentation, were, "Who did this to us?" In the kitchen building, Patience had waited throughout the night. She had heard the screams. She had observed Dr. Beaumont's carriage arrive, had seen neighbors assemble, had witnessed the turmoil developing in the main house. She had stayed in the kitchen, continuing to wash dishes, to tidy, to preserve the routine she had followed for 30 years. When Samuel came to inform her near daybreak that all 8 were deceased, she regarded him with an expression he would subsequently characterize as frighteningly serene, and responded only, "I expect they will require breakfast prepared for the guests who will be arriving today." The immediate aftermath of the deaths plunged the entire Low Country into disorder. 8 individuals from one plantation family deceased within hours of one another was without precedent. The preliminary assumption was cholera or some other contagious illness. Dr. Beaumont, regardless of his private doubts, documented acute gastric fever on the death certificates. To record anything different would have necessitated him explaining what he suspected but could not verify. Within 24 hours, neighbors started arriving to assist. The bodies required preparation for burial. The household needed organization, and choices needed to be made regarding the plantation's future. The Rutledge family had distant relatives in Charleston, yet none arrived for nearly 3 days, the time needed for news to reach them. During those 3 days, Patience persisted in her work. She prepared meals for the visitors, cleaned the house, and carried out her responsibilities with the same quiet effectiveness she had always exhibited. Several of the neighbor women later commented on her self-possession. She did not weep a single tear, one recorded in her journal. "I believed perhaps the shock had frozen her sorrow." The funeral occurred on November 28, for days following the deaths. All 8 family members were interred in the small cemetery on the plantation grounds, their graves indicated with simple stones. Reverend Thomas Mackenzie, who conducted the service, delivered a sermon about God's inscrutable ways and the importance of accepting divine will. Nearly 200 individuals attended. Patience stood at the rear of the crowd, her countenance expressionless. The investigation, such as it was, started almost immediately following the funeral. Dr. Beaumont, troubled by what he had seen, spoke confidentially with the county sheriff, Benjamin Hartwell. Sheriff Hartwell, a pragmatic man with limited patience for medical puzzles, was disposed to accept the fever diagnosis and conclude the matter. However, Beaumont was persistent. "I have treated hundreds of fever cases," he informed the sheriff. This was not fever. The symptoms were consistent with poisoning, specifically with some type of plant toxin, the convulsions, the speed of onset, the fact that all 8 were affected identically. All of this indicates deliberate introduction of poison into food or drink. Sheriff Hartwell grasped the consequences immediately. If the Rutledge family had been poisoned, the most probable suspect was evident. Patience had prepared the meal. She was enslaved. And under South Carolina law during that period, an enslaved person who killed a white person was liable to execution, normally by hanging, occasionally by burning. However, there were complications. Firstly, there was no tangible evidence. The food had been largely eaten or discarded. The few samples that persisted displayed nothing unusual upon visual examination, and there were no chemical tests accessible at that time and location capable of detecting plant toxins. Secondly, there were no observers to any questionable behavior. Samuel, who had labored alongside Patience that day, testified that she had prepared the meal precisely as she always did, using components from the plantation's own supplies. Thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, there was the issue of motivation and chance. If Patience had desired to poison the family, she could have done so at any moment over the preceding 30 years. Why at this particular time? Why on Thanksgiving? And why would she have stayed at the plantation afterward rather than escaping? Sheriff Hartwell interrogated Patience on December 1 in the dining room of Sweetwater Hall with Dr. Beaumont and 2 other observers present. The interview was documented in the sheriff's official records, and those records persist in the Colleton County archives. "Did you prepare the Thanksgiving meal served on November 24? Hartwell inquired. "Yes, sir," Patience responded. "Did you prepare it the same way you always prepare such meals?" "Yes, sir." "Did you add anything unusual to the food?" "No, sir." "Did you have any reason to wish harm to the Rutledge family?" Patience paused for an extended moment before answering. The witnesses subsequently disagreed on how to construe that hesitation. Some believed she was thoughtfully formulating her reply. Others thought she was undergoing authentic sorrow or bewilderment. "No, sir," she finally stated. "You are aware that all 8 members of the family died after eating the meal you prepared?" "Yes, sir." "And you have no explanation for this?" "I expect it was the fever, sir, as the doctor indicated." Hartwell questioned her for another hour, yet her responses never deviated. She had prepared the meal as she always did. She had used components from the plantation supplies. She had no explanation for the deaths. She exhibited no feeling throughout the questioning, which Hartwell noted in his report as suspicious in itself. However, lacking proof, lacking witnesses, and lacking an admission, there was nothing he could charge her with. The law demanded proof even when the accused was enslaved. Suspicion was insufficient. The Charleston relatives who eventually came to settle the estate confronted a difficult choice. Patience was valuable property valued at a minimum of $600, yet she was also possibly hazardous. If she had poisoned the Rutledge family, what would prevent her from poisoning whoever purchased her subsequently? The agreed solution was to dispose of her quickly and quietly without referencing the circumstances of the Rutledge deaths. In January of 1858, she was sold to a merchant named Edward Fletcher, who managed a dry goods store in Charleston and required domestic assistance. The sale price was $400, a notable reduction that provoked no inquiries because it was clarified as a rapid estate settlement. Patience departed Sweetwater Hall on January 15, 1858. She had resided there for 38 years. She never returned and she never saw Grace again. Edward Fletcher's household in Charleston was modest. Fletcher himself, his wife Margaret, and their 2 young daughters, ages 8 and 6. They occupied quarters above the store on Meeting Street in a relatively small apartment that was nevertheless far more comfortable than the accommodations Patience had occupied at Sweetwater Hall. Fletcher was an anxious man, slender and pale, with a persistent cough that his wife ascribed to the humidity of Charleston's climate. He had purchased Patience notwithstanding his wife's protests because he required assistance in the store and could not manage to hire free workers. Margaret Fletcher expressed her displeasure with the arrangement clearly from the beginning. "I know what occurred at that plantation," Margaret informed her husband within Patience's hearing on the first day. "Everyone knows. And you brought her into our residence where our children rest." The sheriff discovered no proof, Fletcher responded weakly. "It was fever. The physician stated so." However, Margaret's anxieties were not unreasonable, because by 1858, rumors concerning the Thanksgiving fatalities had disseminated throughout Charleston's social circles. The narrative had evolved with each repetition. Some versions claimed that Patience had confessed prior to fleeing. Others maintained that tangible proof had been uncovered but suppressed. A few even proposed that Patience had practiced African witchcraft and cursed the food, though these versions were regarded as less plausible than the poisoning theory. The reality was that nobody knew for certain what had transpired at Sweetwater Hall. However, everyone held an opinion. And in a society founded on the forced labor of enslaved people, the possibility that one of them had successfully killed 8 members of a plantation family was profoundly, fundamentally menacing. Patience's existence in the Fletcher household was meticulously supervised. Margaret demanded that Patience never be left alone with food preparation. All meals were either prepared by Margaret herself or prepared by Patience under Margaret's direct oversight. Patience was not permitted near the family's sleeping areas unsupervised. She was provided a locked room at the rear of the store and was obliged to stay there after the store closed each evening. For 6 months, nothing unusual transpired. Patience carried out her responsibilities with the same quiet competence she had always demonstrated. She was polite, deferential, and provided no reason for complaint beyond Margaret's persistent apprehension. Fletcher's business actually improved somewhat during this interval, as Patience demonstrated greater proficiency at managing stock than he had. Subsequently, in July of 1858, Edward Fletcher became unwell. The illness started with stomach cramps and nausea, comparable to, but less intense than what the Rutledge family had undergone. Fletcher's family physician, Dr. Raymond Cland, identified it as acute dyspepsia and suggested a bland diet and avoidance of alcohol. Fletcher improved within a few days. 2 weeks later the symptoms returned, more severe this time. Fletcher was confined to bed for 4 days. Dr. Cland, growing worried, started asking more detailed questions regarding Fletcher's diet and daily schedule. When he discovered that patients had been acquired from the Rutledge estate, his worry deepened into alarm. "That woman needs to be removed from your household immediately," Cland informed Fletcher and Margaret in early August. "I do not care what the sheriff stated or what the official cause of death was. The timing and nature of your illness is too similar to be coincidental." Fletcher, however, was in a predicament. He had paid $400 for Patience. He could not simply dismiss her without selling her first. And selling her would mean either enduring a considerable financial loss or deceiving the buyer about her history. He required time to locate a resolution. The resolution, when it materialized, was not what anyone anticipated. On August 17, 1858, a woman appeared at Fletcher's store, requesting to speak with Patience. She was well attired, clearly from Charleston's merchant class, and she presented herself as Mrs. Catherine Lell, spouse of a shipping agent. She had an unusual request. "I understand you have in your household a woman named Patience, formerly of Sweetwater Hall Plantation," Mrs. Lell said to Fletcher. "I wish to purchase her from you." Fletcher was promptly suspicious. "May I ask why?" he said. Mrs. Lell's expression was challenging to interpret. "I possess information regarding her daughter," she said. "Information she has been seeking for many years. I am willing to pay you $600 for her, which I believe is above what you paid." This was an extraordinary proposal. Fletcher had anticipated losing money on Patience's resale, not profiting from it. Yet he was also profoundly wary. If Mrs. Lell knew about Grace, she almost certainly knew about the Thanksgiving deaths. Why would she pay a premium for someone suspected of multiple murders? "I will need to consult with my wife," Fletcher said. "Of course," Mrs. Lell replied. "I will return tomorrow at the same time, but please understand, Mr. Fletcher, this offer will not remain open indefinitely. I am prepared to complete the transaction immediately if you agree." That evening, the Fletchers debated the offer. Margaret desired to accept immediately, both for the profit and to eliminate Patience from their residence. Edward was torn between financial sense and a growing inquisitiveness regarding Mrs. Lell's true intentions. Ultimately, avarice and dread combined to generate a decision. The next day, when Mrs. Lell returned, Fletcher consented to the sale. The paperwork was finalized within an hour. Patience, who had not been consulted about any of this, was informed that she had been sold again and would be departing with Mrs. Lell immediately. As they walked away from Fletcher's store, Mrs. Lell spoke for the first time directly to Patience. "I imagine you have questions," she said. Patience, after 11 years of containing every feeling, every notion, every glimmer of hope or fury, permitted herself one question. "Do you know where Grace is?" Mrs. Lell ceased walking and rotated to face her. "I do," she said, "and I will tell you. However, first, there is something you need to comprehend regarding who I am and why I have done this." Catherine Lell was not who she professed to be. Her actual name was Catherine Brennan, and she was not the spouse of a shipping agent. She was a widow whose husband, a Methodist minister named Thomas Brennan, had perished from yellow fever in 1856. Since his death, she had committed herself to a cause that was both dangerous and unlawful in South Carolina. She was an abolitionist, not merely an abolitionist in sentiment, which many Charleston residents were privately, but an active participant in the network of individuals who assisted enslaved people in escaping to freedom in the North. She was, in contemporary terms, a conductor on the Underground Railroad, though that expression was not extensively employed at that time in South Carolina. Mrs. Lell's work was financed by Northern abolition societies and carried out with extreme prudence. South Carolina possessed some of the strictest regulations in the nation regarding abolition activities. Anyone apprehended assisting enslaved individuals in fleeing could be imprisoned, fined substantial sums, or even executed depending on the circumstances. The social repercussions were similarly severe. Exposure would entail complete ostracism from Charleston society. She had discovered Patience's story through the abolitionist network. News of the Thanksgiving fatalities had traveled through informal channels, murmured in the quarters of enslaved people across the Low Country, transmitted along to those who might utilize such information. To many enslaved people, Patience had become a figure of dark legend. The woman who had supposedly killed 8 white people and walked away unpunished. Whether the story was accurate or not, Mrs. Lell perceived opportunity. If Patience had indeed done what people alleged, she was someone of exceptional bravery and competence. And more importantly, she was someone who had every reason to despise the system that had enslaved her and stolen her child. "I need you to understand something, Mrs. Lell informed Patience as they walked through Charleston streets toward a boarding house on the city's perimeter. "Everything I am about to tell you could result in both of us being killed if the wrong people learn of it, but I believe you can be trusted. I believe you have already demonstrated that you can keep secrets." Over the subsequent 3 hours, in a locked room at the boarding house, Mrs. Lell elucidated the network she was part of, the pathways employed to transport people north, the safe houses, the contacts, the methods of communication. She explained that she had been performing this work for 2 years and had successfully aided 19 people in attaining freedom in Pennsylvania and New York. And subsequently she explained why she had pursued Patience specifically. "I require someone who can operate in a plantation household," Mrs. Lell said. "Someone who will not attract suspicion. Someone who can recognize which enslaved people are prepared to flee and can be relied upon. Someone who can transmit information to me regarding plantation routines, security, the movements of overseers and masters. You possess skills that are valuable to this work, but more than that, I believe you possess motivation." Patience listened without speaking. When Mrs. Lell finished, she posed the question that had been consuming her thoughts since they departed Fletcher's store. "Where is Grace?" Mrs. Lell's expression softened marginally. "She is in Montgomery, Alabama. She was sold twice after departing South Carolina. The first sale was to a cotton plantation outside Mobile where she labored for 4 years. The second sale was to a merchant family in Montgomery, where she currently works as a domestic servant. She is alive. According to our contacts, she is in reasonably good health. Can you get her out?" "Potentially, but the logistics are extremely difficult. Alabama is considerably further from the north than South Carolina. The routes are longer, the dangers greater. It would require substantial resources and careful planning." Patience absorbed this information silently. Subsequently she inquired, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to return to plantation work, Mrs. Lell said. "I can position you in a household where you will have access to information we need. In return, I will work toward bringing Grace to freedom. I cannot guarantee it will occur quickly. I cannot guarantee it will occur at all. However, I can guarantee that I will try and that I possess resources you do not. And if you refuse, then I will assist you in reaching the north yourself if you wish. You have already paid a terrible price for your freedom. Though you are not legally free, you deserve to exist without fear. However, I am asking you to do something more. I am asking you to utilize what you have learned, what you have endured to assist others." Patience contemplated this for an extended moment. Beyond the boarding house window, Charleston continued its daily activities, oblivious to the conversation occurring in the locked room. Finally, she spoke. "I need to know one thing," she said. "The people you help escape. What becomes of them? Do they truly reach freedom?" Mrs. Lell met her eyes directly. "Most of them do. Some are recaptured. The risk is genuine. However, those who make it to Pennsylvania or New York, they are free. They can work, marry, have families, exist as human beings rather than property. It is not paradise. The North possesses its own biases, its own cruelties, yet it is superior to this." "Then I will do what you ask," Patience said, "on one condition. When Grace reaches freedom, I want to see her. I do not care how long it requires. I do not care what I must do in the meantime. However, when she is safe, I want to see my daughter again. I will do everything in my power to make that happen," Mrs. Lell said. They shook hands. In that moment, Patience dedicated herself to a course that would define the remaining years of her existence. She would return to the realm of plantation houses and forced servitude. However, this time she would be present by choice, not by law. And this time she would be laboring not merely for herself, but for others who shared her suffering. Over the subsequent 3 weeks, Mrs. Lell arranged Patience's placement at a plantation called Riverside located 40 miles inland from Charleston along the Santee River. The plantation was owned by a man named Jonathan Hargrove who had recently lost his cook to pneumonia and was seeking a substitute. Mrs. Lell, utilizing her connections in Charleston Merchant Society, recommended Patience, carefully omitting her connection to Sweetwater Hall. Patience arrived at Riverside in mid-September of 1858. The plantation was larger than Sweetwater Hall with over 400 acres and 60 enslaved workers. Hargrove was a shrewd businessman who took pride in operating an efficient establishment. His supervision was thorough but not brutal. He was by the standards of the time and place regarded as a relatively humane master, which meant he did not regularly beat people to death and furnished adequate food and shelter. Within weeks, Patience had established herself as an excellent cook and a reliable worker. She learned the patterns of the household, the behaviors of the overseer, the schedules of who came and went and when. She identified which of the enslaved workers might be prepared to attempt flight and which could be entrusted with sensitive information. And gradually, carefully, she started to transmit information to Mrs. Lell through a network of contacts, a laundress who made weekly excursions to Charleston, a free black man who delivered provisions to the plantation, a white merchant who was secretly sympathetic to abolition. The information was straightforward but valuable. When Hargrove would be away on business, when the overseer was preoccupied with other matters, which paths through the swamp were navigable at which times of year, where dogs were kept, and how they could be evaded. Over the subsequent months, 3 individuals escaped from Riverside Plantation using information Patience had supplied. All 3 reached Pennsylvania safely. Mrs. Lell transmitted word of their success through the network, and with that word came a message for Patience. Your daughter is being relocated to a safe location in preparation for her journey north. Remain patient. However, patience, the virtue for which she had been named, was becoming progressively challenging to sustain. Each day in the Hargrove household reminded her of what she had forfeited. Each time she prepared a meal, she reflected on the Thanksgiving dinner at Sweetwater Hall. Each time she observed Hargrove's young daughter, she thought of Grace at 10 years old, ripped away from her mother. The fury that she had directed into scheming and executing the poisoning of 8 individuals had not dissipated. It had merely been rechanneled. And as weeks transformed into months with no word of Grace's successful escape, that fury started to blaze more intensely. In March of 1859, 16 months after the Thanksgiving deaths, Patience received a message from Mrs. Lell that would test her self-control more severely than anything since Grace had been taken. The message was concise. Grace's escape attempt failed. She has been recaptured and sold to a plantation outside Selma. We do not currently have contacts in that area. Efforts to establish a route are ongoing. Do not lose hope. When Patience perused those words, standing in the kitchen building at Riverside on a warm March afternoon, something inside her turned cold and motionless. She had waited 11 years for vengeance on the Rutledge family. She had waited another 16 months for her daughter's freedom. And now she was being instructed to wait longer. That night, Jonathan Hargrove's evening meal incorporated a dish that Patience had not prepared in over a year. Ham with brown sugar glaze. Jonathan Hargrove became violently ill approximately 2 hours after finishing dinner on March 12, 1859. The symptoms were familiar to anyone who had perused Dr. Beaumont's notes from Sweetwater Hall. Severe vomiting, intense abdominal cramping, profuse perspiration, muscular weakness, and eventually convulsions. However, unlike the Rutledge family, Hargrove endured. There were 2 reasons for this. Firstly, Patience had administered a smaller quantity than she had used at Sweetwater Hall, either deliberately or because her hand trembled when she added the powder to his food. Secondly, Hargrove's household included a physician's widow, Mrs. Ann Pritchard, his mother-in-law, who was visiting from Charleston. Mrs. Pritchard had observed her husband treat dozens of poisoning cases during his career, and she identified the symptoms immediately. She compelled Hargrove to consume massive quantities of water blended with ash from the fireplace, inducing vomiting beyond what the poison had already triggered. She maintained his consciousness through willpower and repeated applications of cold water to his face and chest, and she dispatched for a physician immediately, not waiting to observe if the symptoms would resolve independently. Dr. Henry Stillwell arrived within an hour and persisted with the aggressive treatment Mrs. Pritchard had initiated. Between the two of them, they likely preserved Hargrove's life. By dawn, he was stable, though weak. By the subsequent evening, it was evident he would survive. Yet Mrs. Pritchard had not preserved his life out of compassion alone. She had also meticulously observed what had transpired and when. She understood that Hargrove had dined at 6 o'clock. She understood that symptoms started at 8 o'clock. She understood that only Hargrove had been impacted, which signified the poison had been in his portion specifically, not in a communal dish. And she understood who had prepared the meal. The revelation of what Mrs. Pritchard located in the kitchen building would become the focal point of the prosecution's case. She had waited until dawn, when Hargrove's condition had stabilized, prior to conducting her search. She had been methodical, inspecting every jar, every container, every conceivable hiding place where something hazardous might be kept. The loose floorboard beneath the preparation table had revealed itself with a slight creak when she stepped on it. Beneath it, wrapped carefully in a piece of old linen, was a cloth bag no larger than a woman's hand. Inside that bag was approximately 2 ounces of dried root material already ground into a coarse powder. Mrs. Pritchard had been careful not to handle it directly. She possessed her late husband's medical volumes in her traveling trunk, and she dedicated the subsequent hour comparing the physical attributes of the powder to descriptions of various poisonous plants. Water hemlock root, when dried and ground, exhibits a distinctive yellowish-brown hue and a faint unpleasant odor that some equate to parsnips left too long in damp soil. The powder in the bag matched these characteristics precisely. More tellingly, her husband's notes contained a case study from 1843 involving a child who had died after ingesting water hemlock root. The symptoms described corresponded with what she had witnessed in Hargrove almost exactly. When Sheriff William Talbot arrived at Riverside on March 14 to investigate, Mrs. Pritchard presented him with the evidence and a written declaration detailing her discoveries. She also presented him with something else, a hypothesis. This woman did not act on impulse, Mrs. Pritchard informed the sheriff in Hargrove's study, with Hargrove himself, still weak but recovering, listening from a chair by the window. The poison was prepared in advance, concealed deliberately. This suggests premeditation and planning. And if she planned to poison Mr. Hargrove, who had shown her no particular cruelty, what might she have done to previous masters? Sheriff Talbot had been in law enforcement sufficiently long to recognize where this line of reasoning led. You are suggesting she may be connected to other incidents. I am suggesting that someone should inquire whether she has any history of similar occurrences, Mrs. Pritchard replied. Hargrove, his voice still affected from the ordeal, contributed a critical piece of information. I purchased her from Edward Fletcher in Charleston. Fletcher purchased her from the Rutledge estate settlement. The Rutledge family, if you recall, died under mysterious circumstances in late 1857. The connection, once established, seemed obvious in hindsight. Within hours, Sheriff Talbot had dispatched telegrams to Colleton County requesting all accessible information regarding the Sweetwater Hall deaths. By evening, he had obtained a response from Sheriff Hartwell, who had investigated those deaths and had harbored suspicions about Patience that he had been unable to substantiate. Patience was apprehended the next morning while preparing breakfast. She had displayed no indication of planning to flee. She had persisted with her work as though nothing had transpired, as though Hargrove's near death was merely an unfortunate coincidence. When Sheriff Talbot confronted her in the kitchen, inquiring directly if she had poisoned Hargrove's food, she had looked at him with an expression he would subsequently characterize as utterly devoid of remorse or fear, and stated simply, "I have nothing to say to you." She was transported to the county jail in Charleston that same day. The trip required 6 hours by wagon, and throughout the entire journey, Patience spoke only once. As they passed through a small town along the route, she inquired of the deputy accompanying her what month it was. When he informed her it was March, she nodded and uttered nothing further. The trial of Patience commenced on April 26, 1859 in the Charleston courthouse. The structure was packed with onlookers from the initial day. News of the arrest had spread swiftly, and the connection to the Sweetwater Hall deaths had transformed what might have been a routine case into something far more sensational. The prosecution was directed by District Attorney Marcus Sullivan, an ambitious lawyer who recognized that this case could advance his career. His opening address was designed to horrify. Gentlemen of the jury, you will hear evidence of a woman who has exploited her position of trust in the households of respectable families to commit acts of murder that are almost unparalleled in their magnitude and brutality. This is not a case of spontaneous violence or self-defense. This is calculated cold-blooded poisoning carried out with planning and deliberation. The evidence presented over the initial 2 days was damning. Dr. Stillwell testified about Hargrove's symptoms and his opinion that they were consistent with plant poisoning. Mrs. Pritchard testified about discovering the concealed poison and described in detail the methodical way she had searched the kitchen. Sheriff Talbot presented the tangible evidence, the cloth bag, its contents, the linen wrapping. On the 3rd day, the prosecution summoned Sheriff Hartwell from Colleton County. His testimony regarding the Sweetwater Hall investigation was particularly damaging. He described his suspicions at the time, his interrogation of Patience, her calm demeanor, and his frustration at being unable to prove anything. I knew instinctively that something was wrong, he testified. However, lacking evidence, lacking confession, lacking witnesses, my hands were constrained. Dr. Beaumont's written notes from that night were admitted as evidence and read aloud to the jury. The descriptions of the Rutledge family's suffering were graphic enough that several jury members visibly responded. The parallels between those symptoms and what Hargrove had undergone were undeniable. The defense attorney, Robert Mansfield, was a young lawyer who had been practicing for less than 2 years. He had been designated by the court because Patience, as enslaved property, could not engage her own counsel and had no one willing to finance her defense. Mansfield was in an untenable situation. The evidence was overwhelming. Public sentiment was against his client and he had almost no resources to mount an effective defense. His approach, such as it was, concentrated on creating uncertainty about the connection between the two incidents. He argued that the Sweetwater Hall deaths had been officially ascribed to gastric fever, not poisoning. He noted that no tangible proof had been discovered at Sweetwater Hall linking Patience to any wrongdoing. He proposed that the poison located at Riverside might have been placed by someone else, though he could not offer a plausible theory regarding who or why. His cross-examination of Mrs. Pritchard was particularly feeble. Is it not possible, he inquired, that the powder you found could have been present for innocent purposes, perhaps for controlling rodents? Mrs. Pritchard's response was devastating. I am acquainted with the substances commonly employed for rodent control, Mr. Mansfield. They are typically arsenic-based compounds that would appear quite differently from what I discovered. Moreover, water hemlock root is not an effective rodenticide. Its primary characteristic is that it is lethal to humans and livestock. There is no innocent explanation for its presence in that kitchen. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before delivering a guilty verdict on the charge of attempted murder of Jonathan Hargrove. Subsequently came the moment that transformed the trial from a straightforward criminal case into something that would be discussed in legal circles for decades afterward. During the sentencing phase, prior to Judge Abraham Townsend pronouncing sentence, Mrs. Pritchard rose and addressed the court. Your Honor, before sentence is passed, I believe this court and this jury should be aware of the full scope of this woman's crimes. Based on the evidence presented and my own investigation, I am convinced that she is also responsible for the deaths of 8 members of the Rutledge family on November 24, 1857. The courtroom erupted. Judge Townsend commanded order repeatedly before finally threatening to empty the room. When quiet was reinstated, he addressed Mrs. Pritchard directly. Mrs. Pritchard, this is highly irregular. The defendant has been tried and convicted on charges relating to your son-in-law. The Sweetwater Hall matter is a separate incident that has never been prosecuted. With respect, Your Honor, I believe justice demands that we acknowledge the full pattern of this woman's behavior. If she is to be sentenced, the sentence should reflect not just one attempted murder, but multiple successful ones." Judge Townsend was silent for an extended moment, considering the implications. Subsequently, he made a decision that would be controversial, even by the standards of 1859 Southern justice. The court will recess for 1 week. During that time, the prosecution will prepare additional charges relating to the deaths at Sweetwater Hall. The defendant will be held pending this additional proceeding. The second phase of the trial commenced on May 4, 1859. This time, the charge was murder, 8 counts. The evidence was entirely circumstantial. The prosecution could not produce the poisoned food, could not produce witnesses to the act of poisoning, could not even definitively prove that poisoning had occurred at Sweetwater Hall since the official cause of death had been listed as fever. What they could prove was opportunity, means, and motive. Patience had prepared the meal. She had access to the means as demonstrated by what was discovered at Riverside. And the motive, they argued, was the sale of her daughter, Grace, 11 years earlier. This was where Marcus Sullivan delivered his most powerful argument. He summoned to the stand a merchant named David Lawson, who had been present at Sweetwater Hall on the day Grace was sold. Lawson testified that he had witnessed the transaction and had observed Patience's reaction when she realized what was occurring. "I have never forgotten it," Lawson said quietly. The sound she produced was not quite human. It was the sound of something fracturing that could never be restored. And the expression on her face, "I have seen wounded creatures with more hope in their eyes." Sullivan turned to the jury. "Gentlemen, we have established motive. A mother's affection twisted into a mother's hatred by an unbearable loss. We have established opportunity. She prepared every meal that family consumed for 3 decades. And we have established means. She possessed the knowledge and the material to commit these murders. The only question before you is whether she actually did so." Mansfield's defense in this second phase was even weaker than in the first. He possessed no alternative explanation for the deaths. He could only argue that suspicion was not proof, that circumstantial evidence was not sufficient for a conviction of this magnitude. The jury in the second trial deliberated for 90 minutes before returning guilty verdicts on all 8 counts of murder. On May 8, 1859, Judge Townsend sentenced Patience to death by hanging. Under South Carolina law, the sentence would be carried out within 30 days. There would be no appeal. During the 3 weeks between sentencing and execution, Patience was confined in a cell in the Charleston jail's condemned section. The cell was small, perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet, with a single barred window high on one wall that permitted a narrow shaft of sunlight during the morning hours. She was provided a straw mattress, 1 blanket, and access to a Bible that she could not read. She was permitted no visitors except the court-appointed chaplain, a Methodist minister named Reverend James Carlson, who came twice a week to pray with her and urge her to confess her sins prior to meeting her Maker. Carlson was a young man, sincere and well-intentioned, who genuinely believed he was endeavoring to save Patience's eternal soul. Their conversations, documented in Carlson's private journal, reveal a woman who stayed defiant to the end. When he inquired if she wished to confess to the murders, she informed him, "I have nothing to confess. Confession requires regret, and I possess none." When he pressed her, inquiring if she felt no remorse for taking human lives, she responded, "Those people were not human in the eyes of the law. I was not human in the eyes of the law. Inform me, Reverend, can an animal commit murder, or does murder require that both the killer and the killed be recognized as human beings?" Carlson found this response profoundly disturbing. He recorded in his journal, "She speaks with a clarity and intelligence that renders her crimes all the more horrifying. She is not insane. She is not bewildered. She knew precisely what she was doing, and she believes it was justified. How does one minister to such a soul?" On his final visit 3 days prior to the execution, Carlson asked Patience if she had any final words she wished to have documented. Any message for those who would remember her. She gave him only one message which he transcribed verbatim. "Tell my daughter Grace that I never cease searching for her. Tell her that everything I did because I loved her." Tell her that she should be free. Carlson inquired if she knew where Grace was. Patience shook her head. I do not know if she is alive or dead. I do not know if she remembers me. However, if she lives, and if she ever discovers what happened to me, I want her to know that I loved her more than my own life. That message, inscribed on a single sheet of paper in Carlson's careful handwriting, was placed among his personal documents. It would not be uncovered until 1932 when his grandson donated those papers to the Charleston Historical Society. By then, if Grace had survived, she would have been 96 years old. The final days prior to the execution were characterized by unusual activity in Charleston's abolitionist circles, though this would not become evident until years later. A woman matching Catherine Lell's description was observed multiple times near the jail, though she never attempted to visit patients directly. Currency changed hands in back rooms and quiet corners. Communications were sent north by methods that deliberately left no paper trail. On the morning of June 1, 1859, Patience was led from her cell at 9 o'clock. She had been provided a simple grey dress to wear, newer and cleaner than anything she had possessed in life. Her hands were secured behind her back, and a hood was prepared to place over her head once she reached the scaffold. The execution was to occur in the courtyard behind the jail, as was customary. A platform had been constructed specifically for this purpose with 13 steps ascending to the scaffold. A symbolic number that Patience likely did not observe or concern herself with. The noose had been tested the previous evening with weights to ensure it would operate correctly. A crowd of approximately 300 individuals had assembled. Public executions remained common entertainment in 1859, though perspectives were starting to evolve. In the crowd were plantation owners and their wives, merchants, laborers, sailors, and a handful of free black residents who had attended for reasons of their own. Some were present out of morbid inquisitiveness. Others came because they believed justice was being served. A few attended for reasons they could not have expressed, drawn by the spectacle of a woman being executed for declining to accept her enslavement. As Patience was led across the courtyard, she walked steadily without stumbling or needing assistance. Her face was composed, though observers would subsequently disagree about what emotion, if any, manifested in her expression. Some stated she appeared resigned. Others stated she appeared tranquil. A few swore they detected something that resembled triumph. When she reached the scaffold, the executioner, a man named Thomas Greaves, who had been performing this function for the county for 7 years, guided her up the steps. At the summit, he positioned her over the trapdoor and placed the noose around her neck, adjusting it carefully to ensure a swift death. This was considered humane, the minimal courtesy extended even to condemned criminals. Judge Townsend, who had attended the execution as was his practice, posed the required question. "Do you have any final words?" Patience spoke clearly enough that individuals in the front rows of the crowd could hear her, though those further back had to depend on second-hand reports of what she said. "I have nothing to confess because I have done nothing wrong. Everything I did was in service of love and freedom. I regret only that I did not do more." Then she added one final sentence that many in the crowd found incomprehensible at the time, yet which would be debated for years subsequently. "The seeds have been planted. Others will harvest what I could not." The hood was positioned over her head. Reverend Carlson recited a brief prayer. At 9:37 in the morning, Thomas Greaves released the lever and the trap door opened. The official documentation states that death was instantaneous. Patience's body dropped approximately 5 feet and her neck broke cleanly. The prison physician who examined the body afterward confirmed that she had died immediately upon the drop. This was documented as a successful execution carried out according to proper procedure. Her body was interred that same afternoon in the pauper section of the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. Under the law at that time, executed criminals were not entitled to marked graves or proper Christian burial in consecrated ground, though Reverend Carlson insisted on reading a brief service over the grave site, despite the objections of some witnesses. The story should have concluded there, with Patience deceased and buried, her crimes punished, justice served according to the standards of her time and place. And indeed for most people who witnessed or heard about the execution, that is where the story concluded. However, there are threads that extend beyond that June morning, threads that propose the story is more intricate than it appears. Firstly, there is the matter of the plant material discovered in patients' quarters at Riverside. The prosecution claimed it was water hemlock root, and that claim was never effectively contested in court. Yet Dr. Stilwell, the physician who treated Hargrove, later recorded in his private journal that he was not entirely persuaded the symptoms matched water hemlock poisoning. They were comparable, yet not identical. He hypothesized a different toxin might have been involved, possibly a combination of substances he could not identify. Secondly, there is the curious fact that Samuel, the domestic servant who labored alongside patients at Sweetwater Hall, vanished from the historical record entirely after the Thanksgiving deaths. He was not sold with the remainder of the estate property. He was not documented as having died. He simply disappeared. Several historians have speculated that he may have successfully escaped to the north, possibly with assistance from abolition networks. Thirdly, and most intriguingly, there are records from the Underground Railroad network that endured the Civil War. These records, dispersed across various archives in Pennsylvania and New York, include references to a woman named Grace, who arrived in Philadelphia in June of 1859, just weeks after Patience's execution. The timing is precise enough to propose that Grace's escape may have been deliberately coordinated to occur after her mother's death, when authorities would be less likely to connect them. The woman identified as Grace in these records adopted the name Grace Freeman. She established herself in Philadelphia's expanding free black community and labored as a seamstress. In 1864, she married a blacksmith named Thomas Warner. They had 3 children. Grace lived until 1908, passing away at the age of 72. In her obituary published in a Philadelphia newspaper, there is a solitary line that has captivated historians. Mrs. Warner often spoke of her mother, who she described as a woman of remarkable strength and determination, who had sacrificed everything for her daughter's freedom. Whether Grace Freeman was the same Grace who was sold away from Sweetwater Hall in 1846 is impossible to substantiate definitively. The circumstantial evidence is compelling but not conclusive. What is certain is that someone ensured Grace's story did not perish with Patience. Catherine Lell persisted with her work in the Underground Railroad until 1863, when Union forces occupied much of South Carolina and her services were no longer required. She survived the Civil War and spent her final years in Boston, where she died in 1879. In her papers donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, there is a journal entry dated June 15, 1859. It reads, "Today I received word that the package was delivered safely to Philadelphia. The cost was higher than anticipated, but some prices are worth paying. I only wish the sender could know that her investment reached its intended destination." Sweetwater Hall itself fell into ruin during the Civil War. The plantation was burned by Union troops in 1865. The land was never reconstructed. Today, nothing persists of the main house except the foundation stones overgrown with kudzu and forgotten by time. The cemetery where the Rutledge family was interred is still present, yet the gravestones have weathered to illegibility. Local historians in Colleton County occasionally write about the Thanksgiving poisoning, yet they tend to treat it as a footnote to larger narratives about plantation life and the Civil War. The full details of what transpired that November evening have been lost to time, obscured by lost records, faded memories, and the tendency of history to simplify complex stories into morality tales. However, the questions persist. Did Patience actually poison 8 people? If so, how did she obtain the knowledge and materials? Was it premeditated retaliation for her daughter's sale? Or was there another motive? Did she act alone? Or did she have assistance? And what became of the people who knew the truth but never spoke publicly? The official documentation states that Patience was a murderer executed for her crimes. However, the whispered narratives transmitted through generations of descendants of enslaved people in the Low Country convey a different account. They speak of a woman who discovered a method to resist against a system that had stripped everything from her. They speak of a mother's love and a mother's fury intertwined so completely that they became indistinguishable. They speak of justice, even if the law termed it murder. And they speak of a daughter named Grace who lived to be 72 years old, raised 3 children in freedom, and recounted to her grandchildren stories about a mother she barely remembered yet never forgot. The truth regarding what transpired in the dining room of Sweetwater Hall on Thanksgiving Day 1857 perished with patience in the courtyard of Charleston Jail. Yet the repercussions of that evening persisted for decades, impacting lives in ways that cannot be entirely tracked or comprehended. What we understand is this. 8 individuals died after consuming a meal that patients prepared. Another man became severely ill after consuming a meal she prepared. Plant materials capable of inducing those symptoms were discovered in her possession. She was convicted, sentenced, and executed. These are the facts. What we believe, what we suspect, what we choose to construe from those facts remains open to inquiry. History is recorded by those who endure and those who possess the authority to manage the narrative. The voices of the enslaved, the voices of women like Patience who left no written documentation of their thoughts and motivations. Those voices are largely silent. However, silence is not equivalent to absence. The narratives endure, transmitted through generations, transformed and embellished, yet conveying at their core a truth that transcends factual precision. Patience existed. Grace existed. The Rutledge family perished. These things occurred. Whether Patience was a murderer or a freedom fighter, a monster or a hero, depends entirely on whose story you choose to accept. And that choice perhaps reveals more about us than it does about her. What are your thoughts on this story? Do you believe Patience was justified in her actions, or was she a murderer who merited her fate? The boundary between justice and revenge is often more slender than we wish to acknowledge. Share your reflections in the comments below. If you found this historical enigma compelling and desire more in-depth explorations into the darkest recesses of American history, subscribe to this channel and activate that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you believe someone you know would appreciate this narrative of resistance, retaliation, and the complicated nature of historical justice, share this video with them. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.